So I'm Earl Conway. I'm with the Albuquerque Hog Hunters Bass Club. We're a BASS affiliated club. I'm also the conservation director for New Mexico for BASS. I also represent about 4 other bass fishing associations in New Mexico now. I have their proxy. Found out that's real important when meeting with these partners, that they kept telling me, you know, you need to speak with the common voice, and it took me a while to get that. But anyway, I've learned a lot over the last 3 years or 4 years of doing this. Out in Havasu, about 3 years ago, we looked at what they were doing with all the habitat improvement out there, and I got thinking about Elephant Butte, and I had a good discussion with Gene Gilliland about carrying capacity and whether or not we were just moving the fish around or whether we were really helping things. And anyway, that just kept sticking in the back of my mind. But I'm a fisherman. I mean, I've been fishing tournaments for 30 years, and I can't believe it's that long. But all the time on the water, I'm sitting there noticing what's going on and trying to understand it. And I'm not a biologist, I'm an engineer. And that's another source of frustration for me. I hate annual cycles. I want to fix something right now and test my results and fix it if it doesn't work. Biology doesn't work that way, so that's been a little frustrating to me too. But I've noticed that a few things about nature that are very consistent, and so then I started thinking about Elephant Butte and what we could do with Elephant Butte. And I'll get into that in a minute. But the real point was to talk about some of the challenges I've had on this project. I made a proposal to Friends of Reservoirs almost 2 years ago on Elephant Butte, and we kind of got, it was approved and started down that path, but then I ran into this brick wall with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. I had a letter here from the Department of Interior. It says, let's see, based on initial review of the project, we've reviewed the proposed project to enhance fish habitat at Elephant Butte Reservoir. We support the release of funds being requested by the Albuquerque Hog Hunter Organization. Everything seemed fine in this letter until Jeff and I got to this one part, and it says an MOU will be developed to spell out the roles and responsibilities, safety, support, funding, permitting, and monitoring activities. And that's where Fish and Wildlife Service went, time out. All the permits have to be done before you can even start the project. So let me tell you a little bit about the project first, but I will tell you the end of the story. This was signed last Friday by the Albuquerque Office of Bureau Reclamation, and it's my permit. 3 years, and maybe I get to put something in the water now. I've had stuff sitting in my garage from fish hiding for 3 years now. Been stumbling over it, going, got to get a permit to put that in the water. That needs a Clean Water Act 404 permit to do it in Elephant Butte. Likewise, I got some mossback that Ray Stewart dropped back by a couple of years ago, and it's still sitting in my storage shed. So anyway, I'm really anxious to get something in the water. But anyway, here's a little bit about Project Elephant Butte. It's an irrigation reservoir. First thing, this logo. It's New Mexico, New Mexico, but really emphasizes we got to do everything we can with the water we got. We just don't have much water. Again, it's an old reservoir built in the early 1900s, like 1909 legislation authorized it for irrigation. It's been expanded once. It's been full a couple times, but it's not full anymore. Incredibly heavy sediment load. 1/3 of that reservoir's capacity has already been lost. And we're talking a big reservoir. So some of these tons of things that you were talking about, it's not even in the same ballpark as what we're looking at. We're looking at arroyos that are 200 yards wide and 50 feet deep that weren't there 20 years ago. That's all down in the lake now. So anyway, tremendous sediment load. That'll probably be one of my next projects, to start looking up in the watershed. You guys are exactly right. You've got to pay attention to the watershed. So in its recent heyday, in '94, the lake was over 20 miles long, and you can see the sediment load in the photo way at the top of the left hand. You can see the sediment load coming in and affecting the very top end of the lake. That area filled in with 13 feet of sediment just during the time I was fishing it in about 4-year period. It's now a wetland type area. They don't want to call it that because if it's a wetland area, then they have to take a different approach to managing it. But so now that wetland area, or that sediment plug, is clear down here in the middle of this area, that light brown area. but now it's forming a big sediment delta, and basically the spawn has been lost in what's left of the upper half of the lake now, because during the spring it's so muddy that they couldn't spawn if they wanted to. So we're down to a very, very small lake at this point. This may be our new normal. Somebody mentioned that a little while ago. I guess what I didn't show was that the lake used to be up at 4410, to clear the top of this chart. Now this is where it's been the last few years. This may be the new normal for Elephant Butte. We've got new treaties with Mexico. El Paso's pulling a lot more water off of it for municipal use. Just a lot of demand on the water, so this may be it. Everybody was saying, well, just wait for the water to come back up and everything will be great. We'll have a new lake effect. We'll have 6 years of great fishing. And I'm just sitting there going, yeah, I'm not going to wait. So let's figure out what we can do with what we've got now. The key thing here, every year in May, they pull the plug. They start the irrigation cycle. Very predictable situation. And I got to looking at that and saying, well, what can we do with that? Is there anything we could possibly do? Above 4350, there's two things that happen. One, you get into endangered species, yellow-bellied willow flycatcher territory. They've got some nests. And they said, basically, if it gets above 4350, you're done. You can't do any work above 4350, or you're going to have to go through surveys, you're going to have to go check out all the salt cedar areas, make sure there's no nests before you impact them. And so basically my project has to be constrained below 4350. If it gets into those salt cedars, I'm going fishing anyway. At that point we got all the cover we need, not a problem. So one of the things I'm going to try to do with this project is to create a new lake effect without having to wait for a rain event. I'm going to try to use the irrigation cycles to create that new lake effect every year. It's going to be highly experimental. We'll see what happens. You've been hearing about all the habitat we're putting in, and the bottom line is you're putting in a lot of surface area. As Richard was saying, it's that fine surface area. It's not just big chunks of rock or big logs, but you need that fine surface area. You need the stuff, that Dave's cut into the little strips here. But it's even better if it can be natural vegetation, where you do get the organics in it, you get the breakdown, you get some other things going on that you won't always get with an artificial habitat. The main reason Jeff wanted me to talk to you was about, okay, so what did it take to do this project? And how does this really work? The partnerships are incredibly important. I'm from a volunteer organization. I am a volunteer. We don't have any paid employees. I do most of my work between about midnight and 2 in the morning. These guys get their emails from me. I'll say, hey, Sleepless in Albuquerque's at it again. Here's some ideas to think about. New Mexico, we had a Governor Lew Wallace one time, and he said, whatever works somewhere else will never be tried in New Mexico. That's a loose interpretation of what he said, but pretty much it's true. Even though you guys are doing all these wonderful things, we have no legal artificial fish habitats in New Mexico right now. So all these brush piles, all this stuff, I just look at it and drool and go, man, someday. Anyway, we don't have it. It's just not part of the paradigm that the fisheries managers have there. And so I was fighting that to begin with. I didn't have that partnership where I could just go to a fisheries biologist and say, hey, help me out. We're going to go do something else. And it was like, no, what are you thinking? So I'm an engineer, so I said throw up these gears and say, well, okay, we got 3 gears that are well meshed here. Bureau of Reclamation, the New Mexico Game and Fish Department, and New Mexico State Parks. They all agreed that fishing ought to be better at the lake, and they'd like to see it better. But you notice there's nothing driving those gears. Going back to Newton's laws of inertia, an object at rest stays at rest, and an object in motion stays in motion with the same speed in the same direction, unless acted upon by an unbalanced force. I proposed an Adopt a Cove type project to Bureau of Reclamation and said, okay, let's use this Adopt a Cove. I can get these clubs to kind of adopt an area and try to work with it. And the person said, called me back about a week later and he said, it's a really good idea. You ought to go clean up the trash in these areas. And I'm like, maybe I didn't get my point across, okay? So I tried again and I said, okay, let's try Adapt a Cove. We're going to have to try some really creative stuff if we're going to do anything with an irrigation reservoir that drops 20 or 30 feet a year. The normal things are not going to work. That's the new name, is Adapt a Cove. I scared the living daylights out of state parks and recreation right away. I came in with a bunch of seed balls. And I said, gee, we'd like to try these at the lake. And immediately they go, no. It wasn't like, what do you got? It was like, no. So where do I go from here? Well, you got to go talk to the Conservation District. You got to talk to NRCS. You got to go talk to the Invasive Species Coordinator. I actually got an immediate flame mail from the Aquatic Invasive Species person saying I was going to be introducing Eurasian milfoil or something. I guess you get the drift of maybe I was up against a few obstacles here to get this project through. Had to step back and say, okay, it looks like I'm in for it here. And so kind of backed off. What was odd was during this time I was also doing some fundraising. Able to use some of our mercury product to raise a few dollars for the project from BASS. Able to go out to Shimano and get a grant for the students to do some work, which is still sitting in the bank. And then went to Audubon Toyota Together Green Fellowships. Oddly enough, even though I haven't got the money from Friends of Reservoir, raised $17,500 for the project, leveraging the proposal to Friends of Reservoirs. Kind of an interesting turn of events there. And so eventually I said, well, I'm done fundraising for a while because I got to get permits to do anything. But that at least gave me some money to go talk to people in D.C. and other places about the project and get it moving. Bottom line, I'm going to go on to some other stuff here. I do want to talk a little bit about silver bullet plants, though. You guys talked about the button brush, the water willow. Some of that stuff won't work for me. Number one, it's not native, so I can't use it there anyway. But there are certain plants like the western soapberry, the Gooding willow, some things like that that are exceptional habitat if I can get them to grow. So in some cases, we're going to be willing to actually do potted plants, pole plantings, things like that, where if this plant has a chance to grow for 3 or 4 years, it'll grow large enough that it will provide a lot of spawning areas and things like that. I've got students that last week, we're trying to answer some questions. I said, which one of these 61 native species have seeds that'll float? I asked the USDA NRCS person this, and they just kind of looked at me and go, nobody's ever asked us that question. And I said, well, I need to know, because one of the best ways to distribute these seeds is on a windblown day. If I can just get the seeds in the water in the coves I want them, it's going to put them right where I want them. It's going to put them right in the wet zone as this lake's coming down and give them the best chance of germinating. So I had high school kids last week doing their experiments on which seeds will float and eventually germinate. We're trying some really creative stuff. One of the professors down at the Coronado Range in southern New Mexico has done experiments with which seeds will go through cattle and still germinate. And so we're actually looking at kind of spiking the trough for the cattle and saying, well, okay, let's see if we can't get them to help fertilize the seeds and deposit them in the areas where we want and maybe stir up the ground a little bit. And we're trying some really innovative stuff. So we'll see how this goes. I have done other things with other fish habitats. We've looked at Havasu, Potholes Reservoir on the left side, Bartlett Lake. Well, that's not Bartlett. That's an ocean shot there, but at Bartlett they've tried reef balls, concrete reef balls. I'm looking at trying to make those out of recycled plastic fiber so that we can actually move them. It's kind of hard to move a 2,000-pound reef ball. Some of these other structures, I'm hoping to be able to move them around. We're going to suspend some, looking at pallets with brush on top of them. The Christmas trees are still a recreational activity. I don't think you can appreciate how important it is for some of these people, even if those Christmas trees are going to be gone a year from now. It is an important recreational activity. We'll probably do some of those too. This is one of my buddies here. We built some floating islands to use for the Golden Algae Project over in Roswell. This is what we call our cupcake island, but we made it out of pre-existing planters. That's planted with the yellow iris and some other plants. We've had a lot of experience using floating islands. For an irrigation reservoir that's going to drop like crazy, I need to start from the top. This is a way of us creating our own seed colonies on the surface that hopefully will survive the rough weather. But we've got quite a bit of experience now with these floating islands, and it is a good way of creating the seed colonies. These things have an incredible effect on the local phytoplankton population. And you get all kinds of invertebrates, everything coming out of this matrix. It just kind of kicks the food chain in the butt and gets it going, you know. So I've done other work at Elephant Butte with the suspended spawning platforms. Unfortunately, what we found out was we put too much structure near the spawning platform, and it turned into a great crappie area. These guys just killed the crappie that day, and it was right during the middle of the bass spawning period. So we got to make some modifications there. The marine operators already built us a prototype water break with concrete sides on it, and they put the structure in place for us to put in spawning beds there. So we've already started to see some participation by the locals. Look at the bank behind that picture on the right. That's what I've got to deal with most of the places around the lake. That's what it looks like. The lake's down 70 to 90 feet, and it all looks like that. Going back to these 3 gears, what I found out was, yeah, okay, there's 3 gears, but behind every one of those gears, there's a really complex mechanism. Bureau reclamation, it looks like this. There are realtors, there are solicitors, there are permit people, there's a recreation manager, there's a dam operator, and they've all got their own perspective on what needs to get done and how it's going to get done. It's really difficult to try to make sense of this mechanism and say, how are we going to do this? What are we trying to get done? And what can you do? They all have oversight. It doesn't matter whether it's New Mexico Game and Fish and the Game Commission telling them what to do, or Bureau of Reclamation and what Congress is telling them what to do. They've all got their thing cut, and so they're prioritizing. And fish habitat? No, it's not in the cards. Bureau of Reclamation's mission is to deliver water to the irrigation and municipal users. Game and Fish says we can't do anything unless Bureau of Reclamation is going to approve it. And so it's like, wow, here's this deadlock. Finally just said, okay, let's just plow ahead. What do we got to get done? Jeff mentioned some of them. National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA. We had to get a categorical checklist approved. Well, to do that, you have to have a very detailed proposal of your project. Well, I thought my proposal was okay, but no, they want a lot of detail. At the same time, I need to keep some sort of latitude so that the youth could do what they want to do, so that if we had new ideas, we could interject them during the project. So it was a game of trying to write enough detail into it to get the permit, but without giving up on some of the ideas. I did have to compromise on the elevations. I had to compromise on how far north we would go on the lake. But for the most part, kept it open, but still detailed enough that we could eventually get through these things. I think mine ended up being 16, 17 pages of document to get through the categorical checklist. But Jeff and I finally agreed to do that ourselves. It was so tough to get it through the Bureau of Reclamation that Jeff's got enough knowledge in some of these areas. I was environmental manager at Sandia National Labs for a while, so I've been through that rodeo a few times. I did the checklist. Jeff did kind of the summary of the biological assessment. We compromised with the Bureau, got that going, eventually got through those hoops. But then they needed to get through the Clean Water Act 404 permit. And there's a national permit. Bottom line, I still had to write out all the things that we were going to put in the water. So all the concrete, all the cinder blocks, all the Christmas trees. So I'm sitting there going, well, how do you even estimate how many acres of area or square, feet of shoreline you're going to affect? And so finally I decided, I'm just going to make this big enough that I don't have to worry about it. So I took the risk of just saying, we're going to take on a project of Table Rock scope, and we're going to go ahead and scope it out that way and see if it gets approved. And it did. Got plenty of room, latitude to do a lot of things here if I can just get this project rolling. Corps of Engineers has to approve that. Okay, it's not Bureau of Reclamation. So what I found out was there's a lot of spare parts. I found out there's Corps of Engineers needs to do the permit for the 404. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has to do their review for the biological assessment to see if we're going to mess with any silvery minnows or yellow flycatchers or whatever. New Mexico Environmental Department has to do their 401 or something. Turned out BASS got involved. We had to have insurance to cover the people that we were going to have doing the project. Never really thought about that one. Didn't see that one coming. Gene helped me work through that process, and And we finally were able to get the right paperwork in front of the solicitors so that they would accept our insurance. But there were just a lot of spare gears that need to be spun too in order to get things done. At the same time, I had to try to keep my own organizations informed of what was going on, because they're sitting there going, what are you getting us into as a volunteer organization? And what are we signing up to? Once you kind of get the feel of it, it really does, there is a rhyme or reason to how this works. It starts with the owner of the water body, the regulator of the water body. If you don't have their buy-in, you're just totally wasting your time. And I've seen a few false starts in other states. I think one in New Jersey where we had this great idea. The conservation officer went to the lake owner and they go, no, we don't want anything in our lake like that. And it was just literally dead in the water. So this one, the Bureau of Reclamation, was my focal point. I absolutely had to focus on what they wanted. When I was going to school, I learned to write for the professor. When I started to write grants, I learned to write for the board of directors that was going to decide, are we going to approve this grant proposal? This one, I took the same attitude with Bureau of Reclamation and said, okay, what do you want? So a lot of meetings, a lot of emails saying, okay, what do I need to give you to get through this next hoop? And through that, was able to figure out who had authority for what. Oddly enough, Bureau of Reclamation was just totally the focal point. If you could get through it with that one agency, then everything else would fall into place over time. Lessons learned, I should have gone to them earlier, should have listened to them a little more. But at the same time, I learned something from this Audubon Toyota Together Green Fellowship. You never apologize for doing something that's right. And so they told me, don't compromise early. Go in, say what you want, figure out how to get it done, and don't compromise. Don't give away anything until you know that you have to. So that was good advice going into it. I was able to keep that latitude for us to do the full project. Didn't give up on it, just kept pounding away. If I'd understood roles and responsibilities earlier and made sure that I knew who was doing what, I wouldn't have wasted my time with some of the other discussions and things. Now it's getting to the point where I'm talking to our game and fish department. I'd got their input early, but it turns out, in reality, they didn't have a big role in this. They chose not to take a leadership role in it, and now they're kind of trying to figure out, well, what is our role? It's an interesting situation. Here you've got a volunteer organization, you've got the local community stepping up with the money to do the project, and you've got the NRCS telling me what kind of plants I can use and what kind I can't. Bureau of Reclamation signed the permit. Some of these other organizations are just sitting there kind of going, I think we missed that bus. So it's going to be interesting working through this with the Game and Fish Department to figure out what their role really is in this. Hopefully they'll help with the monitoring and some other things. But at this point, they kind of missed the bus. So I'm not sure exactly how this is going to pan out. Bureau of Reclamation was the key. Jeff and I had to share the burden. Permitting agreements, it turned out it was actually a lot simpler than it really looks. If you can get down to those key documents that you need and just plug away at them, there are ways to do it. There's people that know how to do it. It was just a matter of getting with the right people and getting focused. There needs to be continued partnering and continued nurturing of this project. So what was the role of the volunteer in this? I was the unbalanced force. I was a catalyst for change. Come up with new ideas and plans. I mean, things were just kind of stuck. And so it took somebody like me to stick my nose in there and say, we can do something different. We can try something different. Now we've got a list of there's about 30 different ideas that we're presenting to the Game and Fish Department and the local business community on Monday night that says, here's 30 different things that we can do that might make fishing better at Elephant Butte, might make Elephant Butte a better destination for people. And so anyway, that's the role of the volunteer. It's absolutely awesome, and I commend Texas Parks and Wildlife Division and these other Department of Natural Resources organizations that are out there doing things. I'll get there, but it might take 5 years of proving that we can do something together before we can get there. But in some cases, you just have to have faith that this can make a difference, and it's worth putting in the effort to do it. The volunteers, we don't normally work in reviews and permits. That's an untraditional role for the volunteer. It definitely works better if you can get the right agency to do it, but the truth is there. The funding's been cut. These people don't have the resources to do it. Don't be afraid to ask a volunteer to take on something that you might not think they can do. You might be surprised what kind of backgrounds they've got. I work with turtle rescue groups, work with Native Plant Society folks, and I can reach out and touch people that used to work for the Bureau of Land Management, Bureau of Reclamation, Corps of Engineers. There's a lot of retirees out there that are looking for something to do to contribute. Tracking in-kind matching, I hate it. The EPA project I had at Roswell had to track all the in-kind stuff, but scheduling and implementation will be incredibly important on this one. Part of the permit, I have to give them 3 days notice before we're going to have any activity down there. I have to describe the work plan, the safety features, things like that. And so it's not going to be easy. Now the real hard work begins. But anyway, that's a decent role for the volunteers to help with, because you guys don't have time to manage a bunch of volunteers. So it's a good role for us. Friends of Reservoirs, great framework for partnerships. I read the same stuff about Friends of Reservoirs 3 years ago and go, wow, it'd be really cool if we could have a watershed type group or a lake type group. And Monday is the day that I will be proposing to those folks that we create an Elephant Butte Friends of Reservoirs partnership. So we'll see how that one goes. Nonprofit funding pathway, Jeff's perfectly right. I could not have gotten the Audubon Toyota Together Green Fellowship without being able to link to Friends of Reservoirs. They were my sponsor for that particular grant. So it's real important to have that 501c3. New Mexico Bass is a 501c7. It wouldn't work. It had to be a 501c3. Good to have them there. We've got all these ideas and plans. I'm very anxious for us to actually get a full suite of these things available for the memberships to look at. There's so many good things being done everywhere. We need to start sharing those ideas a little bit more. And it was always good for grant funding support, but consultation, advice, and moral support. I mean, there are just certain times I was just ready to give it up. And so it was just good to have Friends of Reservoirs there for moral support. These are specific things that the Bureau of Reclamation could not delegate. They have to do the NEPA stuff. They have to do the endangered species consultation. Sometimes the Department of Natural Resources can do the Section 7 with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, but you still need to keep the main public body owner in the loop on that. Clean Water 404 permit, they were the only ones that could do it. They couldn't assign that responsibility to me. They had to maintain that permit. So there were just some things they just could not do, and we talked about some of the control boundaries. Mexico Game and Fish is kind of sitting there going, yeah, okay, we can do some fisheries management planning. We can help you with putting certain areas off limits. We can look at the size limits. We can do some stocking. We can do some monitoring. But it looks like that's going to be their role. Parks, just coordinating the events. We're going to go through a special permit process with parks. They're also going to help out with education awareness. Every park visitor is potentially a volunteer, because when I do these seed balls or seed plantings or something like that, we literally may be handing out bundles of firewood so they don't cut down any more mesquites and burn them, with seed balls in them, and say, while you're here, please help with the habitat. So a huge volunteer base if I can get it to work that way. So here's the new partners, and these are all rolling in the last 3-4 months. But I think this project's going to go. It's going to have a lot of local support. The high schools, I've got one of those teachers, like one that you were showing a little while ago in Ruidoso, that's just incredibly excited about this project. I got students working on InnoVenture, where they have to create a business plan. So they're doing some really creative stuff to try to come up with new inventions for how to do seeding technologies and carbon sequestration and some other stuff. The retirement community showed up in force 2 weeks ago to meet with the Game and Fish Department. So anyway, I think this is going to go really, really quickly now, and almost caught me by surprise. I wasn't really ready to form the partnership yet, but I think it's time. If there was any vegetation on that shoreline, it got run over, burned, whatever. And so I've got to change the mentality of about 100,000 people that show up down there for Memorial Day weekend. to go drive out on the sand. They go down to relax along the lake. But hopefully I can turn all those into volunteers to help vegetate Elephant Butte.